The wind howled through the trees, bending them with the force of the blizzard. It had started as a quiet snowstorm, but now the snow was thick and furious, swallowing up the small, isolated hut where he lived. Inside, the warmth from the fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls. He sat by the fire, his hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, staring into the flames. It was peaceful, quiet, and he preferred it this way, away from the world and its noise. But then there was a loud knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. Who could be out there in this storm? He rose from his seat and walked cautiously toward the door, his boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. Another knock. It was urgent, frantic even. Whoever it was, they needed help. He opened the door just a crack, peeking out into the swirling snow. And there, standing on the doorstep, was a woman. No, not just any woman. This one was different. Her skin was a pale shade of violet, her eyes large and glowing faintly, and her features seemed unfamiliar. Alien, in fact. She was trembling, her clothes soaked from the snow, her face drawn with fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The human stared at the alien, her wide eyes filled with panic, as though she had seen something terrifying. The woman's body language screamed that she was scared, terrified, even. He didn't know why, but the way she looked at him with those huge, glowing eyes, he felt a chill that wasn't from the storm. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaky, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Her breath came out in soft clouds, mixing with the cold air. Something about her presence, her urgency, made him open the door wider. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "You'll freeze out here," he said, his voice warm despite the situation. The alien woman hesitated. She took a step forward, then another, each movement cautious, as though she wasn't sure whether to trust him. Her eyes stayed fixed on his face, wary, and yet there was an undeniable desperation in her steps. With a shiver, she crossed the threshold into the hut. He closed the door quickly behind her, sealing the cold outside. The wind rattled the windows, but in the warmth of the hut, it was a little better. For a moment, they stood there in silence. He studied her closely, trying to understand. The snowstorm continued to rage outside, but now, in the quiet of the hut, he could hear her soft breathing, like a rhythm he hadn't expected. She was still shaking, her eyes darting around the room nervously, scanning the space as though she feared every corner. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if the words would calm her. She flinched slightly at the sound of his voice, her eyes widening with even more fear. The fear was clear on her face. It wasn't him she feared, was it? There was something else, something bigger, more dangerous. He slowly moved to the fire, his hands warm against the flames as he went to grab a blanket. He turned back to her, hoping she would let her guard down. "You can rest. You're safe here," he said gently. But when she saw him again, her fear only seemed to grow. The alien woman stood frozen in the center of the small hut, her eyes fixed on the human. She was shaking, but not just from the cold. There was a deep, unspoken fear in her gaze. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, as if she were struggling to breathe, but she made no move to speak. She kept her distance, almost as though she expected him to harm her. He didn't understand. He had invited her in, offered her warmth, yet she seemed more afraid now than when she had been outside in the blizzard. "Why are you scared of me?" he asked quietly, stepping closer, his voice soft. "I'm not going to hurt you." But the alien didn't respond. She only backed away, her eyes wide and filled with a deep terror. She glanced at the door, her hands trembling, as though she might bolt at any moment. The man sighed. He wasn't sure what to do. He had never dealt with anything like this before. Sure, he had read about alien encounters, but they didn't prepare him for this. This wasn't a story. This was real. And it seemed that whatever she was running from was much more dangerous than the blizzard outside. He grabbed a chair and pulled it closer to the fire, then sat down, trying to make himself seem less threatening. He spoke again, trying to break the silence. "I don't know what you're running from, but you're safe here. For now. I won't hurt you." She still said nothing. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every corner as though searching for a way to escape. Her fear was almost tangible, and it left him with a sense of helplessness. The man couldn't stand seeing her like this, so frightened and alone. He rose from his chair and walked to a nearby shelf, taking down a cloth and a bowl of water. He didn't know if the alien needed food, but he could at least offer her something to drink. He moved slowly, making sure to keep his actions calm and measured, so as not to startle her. He set the bowl down on a small table and then stepped back, waiting for her to make the next move. The alien woman glanced at the bowl, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. She took a step forward, then stopped, as though afraid to approach. It was only when she saw him sit down again, giving her space, that she took the water in her hands. Her hands were delicate, strange in their shape, with long fingers that seemed almost too thin. She lifted the bowl to her lips, drinking slowly, still watching him warily. After a long moment, she set the bowl down on the table, and for the first time, she spoke. It was a soft sound, foreign and strange, her voice almost musical in its tone. But it was clear that she was trying to communicate. The words didn't make sense to him, but the tone was filled with emotion. Fear, sadness, and relief. He could tell that she was exhausted. The man looked at her, trying to understand. "I don't know what you're saying," he said gently. "But if you need help, I can try. You're not alone." The alien woman's eyes flickered with something, perhaps hope. She met his gaze for the first time, her fear slowly beginning to fade. Though it was still there, lurking beneath the surface. She nodded slightly, as if she understood his words, but she didn't say anything more. The man knew he wasn't going to get answers right away, but something told him that the more time they spent together, the more he would learn, and hopefully, she would begin to trust him. The snowstorm raged outside, but inside the hut, it was warm and quiet. The alien woman sat near the fire now, her eyes still wary but less fearful than before. She had stopped shaking, though her gaze kept darting toward the door every so often, as if she was waiting for something. The human watched her closely, unsure of what to do next. He didn't want to push her too hard, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. Something important. Her fear of him, though fading, still lingered, and it was clear that whatever had caused it ran deep. He sat across from her, watching the way she looked at the flames. Her eyes seemed to study the fire, and for a moment, he wondered if she was looking for something more than warmth. Was she trying to understand it, to make sense of it? Or was she just lost in her thoughts, wondering if she had made the right choice by coming here? After a long silence, the alien woman glanced up at him. Her eyes were soft now, not filled with panic, but still unsure. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, but then closed it again, unsure of how to begin. The man waited patiently, knowing it would take time. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Not all humans are like you," she said, her accent strange. But the words were clear. She looked at him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. The human blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his voice gentle. The alien woman paused before responding, as if choosing her words carefully. "Where I come from, humans are feared. You are seen as dangerous, violent, destructive." Her eyes dropped to the floor, as if ashamed of the words. "We have heard stories, many stories of humans harming those who are different." The man felt a strange weight in his chest. He had heard of alien encounters before, of course, but he had never imagined that he, a simple human living alone in the wilderness, could be seen as a threat. He wasn't violent, nor was he a part of any government or military. He was just a man trying to live a quiet life. "Not all humans are like that," he said softly, almost to himself. I'm not like that. The alien woman lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. She seemed to study him for a moment, as though weighing his words. There was something in her eyes now, something like hope mixed with uncertainty. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but you're the first one I've ever met who doesn't make me feel afraid. The human nodded slowly, understanding. She was running from something, and whatever it was had made her fear all humans, even ones who were harmless. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of her past, but there was also something else there, a small spark of trust, something that hadn't been there when she first entered the hut. She looked away again, her gaze lost in the fire. I'm not supposed to be here, she murmured. I'm not supposed to be anywhere. The words struck him like a blow. The alien woman wasn't just running from the blizzard. She was running from something far worse, something that had forced her to hide, to flee, to be alone. The human felt a surge of sympathy for her, but he also knew that her story was far from over. He needed to help her, to protect her, even if he didn't fully understand what she had gone through. He leaned back, giving her space, but his mind raced with questions. What was she running from? And more importantly, how could he help her? The fire crackled softly, its warm light flickering across the hut. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was a strange kind of calm. The alien woman sat by the fire, her eyes still on the flames. She had stopped trembling, but there was something else in her gaze now, something like a quiet sadness, mixed with a hint of trust. The human man sat on the opposite side of the room, watching her closely. He hadn't pressed her for answers, and she had told him about her fear of humans. He knew she needed time, and he wasn't about to push her further. But it was clear to him now that she was running from something far worse than just a snowstorm. He stood up slowly, deciding it was time to offer her something more than just silence. I'm going to make some food, he said gently. You must be hungry. The alien woman looked up at him, her large eyes filled with curiosity, but also caution. She didn't speak at first, but she nodded slightly. She hadn't spoken much since she arrived, but her nod was enough. It was a sign that she was starting to trust him, even if only a little. The human man moved quietly to a small corner of the hut where he kept his simple supplies: dried meat, vegetables, and a few herbs. He began to prepare a small meal, his hands moving with practiced ease. He didn't know what the alien woman ate, but he hoped that she would be able to stomach something simple, something comforting. As he worked, he couldn't help but think about her words. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be anywhere. The sadness in her voice echoed in his mind. What could she mean by that? Why was she running? He had a million questions, but he knew better than to ask them all at once. She had to be ready to talk, and that might take time. While he prepared the food, the alien woman remained quiet, still watching him from the firelight. She didn't look afraid anymore, but there was still an uncertainty in her eyes. The man could see that she was exhausted, her energy drained not just by the storm, but by whatever had been chasing her. She had carried her fear with her for so long that it was clear she didn't know how to let it go. When the food was ready, he set a simple bowl in front of her. It wasn't much, just some stew, warm and hearty. He smiled at her softly. It's not much, but I hope it's enough. She glanced at the bowl, then back at him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out with her delicate hands and took the bowl, her fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she ate, the human man remained quiet. He didn't want to rush her or make her feel like she had to explain herself. He just wanted to offer her something, a small act of kindness that would hopefully make her feel safer. The alien woman finished the food quickly, her hunger apparent. She set the bowl down and looked at him, her eyes full of something new, a hint of gratitude, though still guarded. Thank you, she said softly, her voice quieter than before, but clearer. It was the first time she had spoken with any kind of certainty. For everything. The human man nodded, feeling the warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "You don't have to thank me," he replied gently. "I'm just glad you're safe." For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. But it was a peaceful silence, one that spoke of shared understanding. Two strangers, alone in a storm, finding comfort in each other's presence. The night outside was still, the storm now reduced to a soft whisper of wind. Inside the hut, the fire continued to burn, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The alien woman sat near the hearth, her body relaxed for the first time since her arrival. She was no longer trembling, though her eyes still carried the weight of whatever she was fleeing from. The man sat across from her, watching the flames, his mind full of questions. They had shared a quiet meal together, but neither of them had spoken much. The woman's fear was still there, but it had faded enough for them to sit in comfortable silence. The man had hoped they could continue this way, a fragile peace between them as they waited for the storm to pass. But the silence didn't last long. Suddenly, the soft crackling of the fire was interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside. Heavy and deliberate, the steps moved closer, crunching the snow beneath them. The alien woman's eyes snapped open, her body going tense. Her earlier calm vanished in an instant, replaced by a wave of panic. She stood quickly, her gaze darting toward the door, then back to the human. Her breathing became shallow, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to say a word for him to understand. Something, or someone, was coming for her. Without thinking, the man jumped to his feet. His heart pounded in his chest as the sounds outside grew louder, more urgent. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't just passing by. They were coming straight for the hut. The alien woman took a step toward the door, then froze. She seemed to be calculating something, but there was no time. The door rattled violently as something heavy struck it from the outside, causing the wooden frame to groan under the pressure. "Stay back," the man said quickly, his voice low but firm. He didn't know who or what was out there, but he wasn't about to let it get to her. He quickly moved to the corner of the room where he kept a simple weapon, a small axe for chopping wood. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The alien woman's eyes widened even further as she watched him. "No," she whispered, her voice strained. "They'll hurt you." "I can't just let them hurt you," the man said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. He had to protect her. There was no other choice. The door rattled again, this time with more force. The man moved quickly, positioning himself in front of the alien woman, blocking her from the door. He could hear muffled voices from the outside, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but it was clear they were looking for her. She wasn't just a runaway. She was someone they had been hunting. "They're here for me," the alien woman said quietly, her voice trembling with fear. "They've come to take me back." The man looked at her, understanding the gravity of the situation. These weren't just random travelers. These were pursuers, dangerous, relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. With one last glance at the woman, the man braced himself. He couldn't let them take her. Not after everything she had shared with him. Not after the bond they had begun to form. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were something more, something worth fighting for. The door shook again, this time threatening to break open. The man's grip tightened on the axe, ready for whatever came next. He had no idea how long they could hold out, but he was determined to do everything in his power to protect her. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside, a new storm was brewing, one that neither of them could avoid. The door trembled violently as the force outside grew stronger. The man tightened his grip on the axe, his knuckles white with tension. The sound of the storm outside was drowned out by the heavy thuds against the door. The woman stood behind him, her breathing quick and shallow, her fear written all over her face. "They're coming for me," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the noise. "They'll stop at nothing." The man didn't turn to look at her. His focus was on the door, his mind racing with thoughts of how to protect her. He couldn't let them take her, he wouldn't let them. But he had no idea who they were or what they were capable of. All he knew was that this woman, this alien, had come into his life in a way he couldn't explain. And now he was willing to do anything to keep her safe. Another loud bang made the door shudder, and the man took a step forward, ready to meet whatever came through. He had no illusions that he could win a fight against multiple armed enemies, but he wasn't about to go down without trying. If he had to fight, he would. The alien woman reached out, her hand touching his arm. The touch was gentle but firm, and he could feel the trembling in her fingers. She didn't want him to fight. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. They are too strong. You can't stop them." He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. There was a pleading in her eyes, but also something else, something he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just asking him to run. She was asking him to make a choice that might change everything. "What are you asking me to do?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "I'm not from here," she began, her voice strained. "I'm not just some fugitive. I'm important. To them. To my people. They will not stop until I'm brought back." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The man's mind raced. She wasn't just any alien. She was someone significant, someone worth risking everything for. But what did that mean for him? What was he really up against? "You're running from your own people?" he asked, his voice soft with disbelief. She nodded, her eyes filling with a mix of sadness and guilt. "Yes, I was supposed to follow their rules, their laws. But I couldn't. I couldn't live with what they wanted me to become. So I ran." The man understood, at least in part. She wasn't just afraid of the storm or the strangers outside. She was afraid of her own past, of the people she had left behind. And now, those people were coming for her. "I can't make this decision for you," the man said, his voice firm. "But I can help you. We can fight them together." The alien woman shook her head quickly, her eyes wide with panic. "No, you don't understand. They'll destroy you. If they find you, they'll hurt you." He paused, considering her words. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had no idea what the alien pursuers could do, but the look in her eyes told him they were capable of unimaginable harm. And yet, he still couldn't bring himself to back down. "I'm not going to run," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Not from them. Not from you." The woman stared at him, her face a mixture of fear and admiration. She opened her mouth to say something, but then the door slammed again, louder this time, as if the attackers had finally decided to force their way in. The man's heart raced as he realized time was running out. He had one chance to make a choice, and it was the only choice that mattered. Protect her or let her go. There was no middle ground. With one final glance at her, he made up his mind. "I'm with you," he said. And with that, the fight for their lives began. The man's heart raced as he gripped the axe tighter, his mind spinning with the weight of the decision he had just made. He had no idea what they were up against, how many of them there were or what kind of weapons they carried. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let them take her. The alien woman was behind him now, her presence a quiet reminder of the danger they were in. She had stopped trembling, but the fear in her eyes was still there, burning bright. Her fingers dug into his arm, her grip tight but desperate. She was afraid. Of the storm, of the attackers, and of what might happen if they didn't make it out of this alive. The door rattled again, and the man's muscles tensed in anticipation. The sound of boots crunching in the snow outside grew louder, and he could hear hushed voices calling out, searching for the woman. They were getting closer. "We don't have much time," the man said, his voice low but determined. "Are you ready?" The alien woman nodded slowly, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wanted to be ready, wanted to fight back, but the fear was still there. She had been running for so long, and now when the moment had come to stand and face what she had been running from, the fear threatened to swallow her whole. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're too strong. I'm just a fugitive, a nobody." The man turned to face her, his expression soft but resolute. "You're not a nobody," he said firmly. "You're someone worth fighting for. And I'm not going to let them take you. Not after everything we've been through." Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the fear seemed to fade. She could see the sincerity in his gaze, the quiet strength that had kept him standing tall even in the face of uncertainty. And for the first time since she had arrived at the hut, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. "They're coming," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to make a choice now, fight or run." The alien woman's heart pounded in her chest as she considered the options. She had been running for so long, always looking over her shoulder, never able to stop and live freely. And now, when faced with the opportunity to stand and fight, the weight of her past bore down on her. But as she looked at the man, this human who had shown her kindness, who had risked everything to protect her, something shifted inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just some stranger. He was someone who cared, someone who had fought for her before, and someone who would continue to fight by her side. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice full of resolve. "I'll fight with you." A sudden crash broke the silence, and the door flew open, splintering under the force of the impact. The man and the alien woman barely had time to react before a group of armed figures rushed inside, their eyes scanning the room. But the man didn't back down. He stood tall, stepping in front of the woman, ready to defend her. The attackers froze for a moment, surprised by his courage, but they quickly regained their composure, their weapons aimed directly at him. The alien woman's heart raced as she stepped up beside him, her hands trembling but her resolve clear. She wasn't just a fugitive anymore. She was someone who had a reason to fight, someone worth protecting. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The moment of truth had arrived, and together, they would face whatever came next. The door burst open, splintering under the weight of the attackers' force. Snow and ice swept in with the wind, but the man stood firm in the doorway, his body blocking the alien woman from view. His hands gripped the axe, knuckles white, but his heart pounded with determination. They had no choice but to fight. And now, there was no turning back. The alien woman stood behind him, her breath quick but steady. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to back down now. The man had stood by her when she was at her most vulnerable. Now, it was her turn to stand by him. The attackers paused in the doorway, surprised by the man's defiance. They were tall, armored figures, their faces hidden behind dark visors. But their eyes, she could see their eyes, were full of intent. They weren't here for peace. They were here for her. "Move aside, human," one of them said, his voice cold and harsh. "She belongs to us." The man's grip tightened on the axe. "Not today," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear creeping at the edges of his mind. The alien woman stepped forward, standing beside him. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. She had run for so long, always looking over her shoulder, but now she wasn't running anymore. She had someone to fight for, and she was going to do whatever it took to protect that. "She doesn't belong to anyone," the man added, his voice rising with more confidence. "Not to you. Not to anyone." The attackers looked between each other, clearly taken aback by the human's courage. But they quickly recovered, raising their weapons, ready to strike. The alien woman's heart raced, but she was no longer afraid. The man had given her strength when she thought she had none left. She stepped closer to him, her hands raised, not in defense, but in a gesture of solidarity. She was with him. Together, they would face this threat. Without warning, one of the attackers lunged forward, swinging the heavy weapon. The man swung the axe to meet it, the clash of metal ringing through the small hut. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through his arms, but he stood his ground, refusing to give an inch. The alien woman didn't hesitate. She moved with precision, using her alien abilities to disarm another attacker before he could react. She was fast, graceful, and deadly. The man couldn't help but watch in awe as she fought. For the first time, he saw her not as a scared fugitive, but as a warrior in her own right. Her fear had turned into something stronger, something fierce. Together, they moved as one, their actions flowing with an unspoken understanding. Every strike, every move, was perfectly timed. The attackers were strong, but they had underestimated the bond between the two of them. In a matter of moments, the last of the attackers was on the ground, disarmed and incapacitated. The man stood panting, the axe still gripped tightly in his hands. Beside him, the alien woman was breathing heavily as well, but there was a quiet sense of victory in her eyes. They had won. Together. The storm outside still howled, but inside the hut, it was as if the world had paused. The man and the alien woman stood side by side, looking down at the attackers they had just defeated. For the first time, they weren't just survivors. They were partners, allies in the truest sense of the word. The alien woman looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. I never thought I could fight like that. But with you, I felt like I could do anything." The man smiled, exhaustion weighing on him. "You've always been strong. You just needed someone to see it." The bond between them was undeniable now. They had fought side by side. And in that moment, they knew they could face anything together. Whatever the future held, they would face it as one. The storm outside still raged, but inside the hut, the warmth of their shared victory filled the air, pushing back the fear that had once consumed them both. They were no longer alone. They had each other. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The wind still howled outside, but inside the hut, it was eerily quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of the man and the alien woman. They stood facing the fallen attackers, their chests rising and falling with the effort of the fight. The man lowered the axe, his arms sore from the tension, but a quiet pride settled in his chest. They had won. Against all odds, they had fought and survived together. He turned to the alien woman who stood beside him, still catching her breath. Her eyes were wide, a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. She was stronger than he had ever imagined. Her movements during the fight had been fluid and precise, her fear gone, replaced by something far more powerful. "You're incredible," the man said, his voice full of admiration. "I never thought." "I didn't either," she interrupted softly, shaking her head. "I never thought I could fight like that. But with you." She looked at him, her gaze soft but full of emotion. "I felt like I wasn't alone anymore." The man smiled, feeling something stir inside him. They had shared a moment of pure trust, and now a bond had formed between them that neither of them could deny. "You were never alone," he said quietly. "I'm here." For a long moment they stood in silence, just taking in the reality of the situation. The storm outside seemed distant now, as though it were part of another world. Inside the hut, there was a strange sense of peace. The alien woman sat down by the fire, rubbing her hands together to warm them. The warmth of the fire felt comforting, but it wasn't just the heat that was easing the tension in her muscles. It was the fact that she had found someone who truly cared about her, someone who had fought by her side when no one else would. The man joined her by the fire, sitting down carefully. He was still processing everything that had happened. The attackers had come for her, an alien woman on the run from her own people. And yet, despite everything, he had chosen to stand by her. He had chosen to fight for her. "I can't thank you enough," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice sincere. "You've got strength. I saw it in you. It's not just me who fought for you. You fought too. You're not just a victim. You're a fighter." She smiled, a small, genuine smile, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. It was fragile, but it was there. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her. A future where she wasn't running anymore, where she wasn't afraid. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," she said, her voice quiet but warm. "Someone who would protect me, no questions asked. Someone who would stand by me, even when the world was against us." The man looked at her, his heart swelling. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You've got a place here, with me." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The connection between them was stronger than anything they could say. It was the kind of bond that could only be formed in the face of danger, in the heart of a storm. As the fire flickered, casting warm light around the hut, the man and the alien woman sat together, side by side. The storm outside might still rage, but inside, they were safe. For now, together, they had survived. And together, they would face whatever came next. The world outside might have been full of danger, but for the first time in a long while, the alien woman felt a sense of calm. She had found someone who cared, someone who would fight for her. And in that moment, it was enough. The fire flickered and popped, sending small sparks into the air, but the warmth it offered couldn't chase away the thoughts that raced through the man's mind. The storm outside had finally begun to settle, but inside the hut, the silence felt heavy, full of unsaid words and unasked questions. The alien woman sat across from him, her gaze fixed on the fire. Her fingers gently traced the rim of the bowl in her hands, but her mind seemed far away, lost in the past, in the memories of what she had left behind. The man could sense the weight of it all. She had run from her people, from a life she could no longer live. She had found him in the middle of a blizzard, scared and alone. But now she wasn't alone anymore. They had fought together, survived together, and somehow that was enough, or at least it had to be. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence. He had been waiting for her to speak, to share what was on her mind, but she hadn't yet. She looked up at him, her large eyes reflecting the firelight. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft. "I've never been in a place like this before. I've never had someone fight for me." He gave a small smile, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't expected. "You've fought for yourself too. I saw that. You're not weak. You're strong." Her lips parted as if to say something, but then she hesitated. "I've always been told that I was weak," she said, almost to herself. "That I couldn't survive alone. That I wasn't meant for this world." The man's heart ached as he listened to her words. The pain in her voice, the deep-rooted fear that had followed her for so long. It was a burden that she had carried alone, but not anymore. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice firm and reassuring. "You have me. You always will, if you want that." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the truth in his words. For a long moment, there was silence between them. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the stillness of the room. "What happens now?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. "Where do we go from here?" The man thought for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. The world outside was still dangerous, still full of people who would see them both as threats. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave her, not now, not ever. "I don't know what's out there," he said slowly, "but as long as we're together, we'll figure it out. We don't have to face it alone." The alien woman nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. She still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope. She didn't have to run anymore, and she wasn't facing the world alone. The wind outside had stopped completely now, leaving only the quiet sound of the night. The world outside felt calmer, but the future still remained uncertain. They didn't know what dangers lay ahead, but they were stronger now together. They had survived the worst, and they would face whatever came next. For now, they were safe, and that was enough. The man looked over at her, and for a moment their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. They had made it through the storm, both the one outside and the one inside them. And as long as they had each other, they knew they could make it through anything.